10 reasons why Russophiles and Putinophiles are wrong on Ukraine. The first point I'd like to make is that often the publications, the so-called scholarly research written by Western apologists of Vladimir Putin are ideologically driven. You can see, for example, in Richard Sakwa's book, Frontline Ukraine, that the conclusion was the first thing he actually wrote, and then he gathered the so-called evidence and footnotes to match his pre-planned conclusion. But more importantly, with the huge explosion of publications on Ukraine and the Ukrainian-Russian war since 2014, the majority of these so-called new experts on Ukraine have never visited Ukraine, and they certainly have never visited the front line in the Donbas region of eastern Ukraine. Because many of them are Russia experts, and we have to understand that in North America and in Western Europe, practically all of the people who head the post-communist, post-Soviet institutes of European Eurasian studies are Russianists. And these Russianists are used to, over the last 2 to 3 decades, using Russian sources. I don't mean Russian language sources, but sources from Russia. So therefore their books tend to be very heavily dominated by footnotes from Russian media sources. Now that's already problematical because Russia is an authoritarian state. The media is heavily controlled, and therefore you're not likely to get much objective reporting in the Russian media, unlike, say, in Ukraine, which has a free media. You also have tremendous bias in that, for example, in Richard Sakwa's book, he cites Putin on so many occasions, but never once cites Petro Poroshenko, the president of Ukraine, which is a bit odd when you're writing a book about the Ukrainian-Russian conflict. In Richard Sakwa's book, the only footnotes from the Ukrainian media are 16 citations of the Kiev Post. If I was to write a book on Russia and my only citations were 16 footnotes from Moscow Times, it would be, of course, not treated as a serious scholarly work. Also, these very Russophile, Putinophiles books that masquerade as scholarly work also do not, or very rarely, interview Ukrainian politicians, Ukrainian civil society leaders, Ukrainian journalists. They tend to ignore that primarily because they don't travel to Ukraine, and Ukraine is outside their comfort zone. They tend to basically only know really Russia. A second point, which is very bizarre in the whole field of Russophilia, Putinophilia, in the sphere of this Ukrainian-Russian conflict since 2014, is this very unholy alliance of far-left socialists with what many people are today describing as, in effect, a fascist regime in Russia. At the very least, an authoritarian, mafioso gangster regime. Why would socialists, people of socialist predication, socialist orientation, want to get into bed with somebody who's a sociopath, a gangster, and a far-right nationalist leader like Putin? Well, what happens is that their anti-Americanism, which is of course prevalent on the left in Canada and on the left in places in Europe, for example, the leader of the British Labour Party, Jeremy Corbyn, seems to love Russia today. Their anti-Americanism translates into them becoming pro-Putin. Putin is the default option, the default ally, because of their very deep-seated anti-Americanism. This creates problems for them in terms of their moral standing. How can far-left socialists who have certain principles, certain politics, really get into bed with great power nationalists, imperialists, fascists, authoritarians, mafiosi, however you want to call them? They also are quite imperialistic in terms of their attitudes, even though they claim to have socialist ideologies. So therefore they support the kind of grand bargain between the US and Russia that Vladimir Putin has long clamored for, a kind of a second Yalta agreement, whereby the US and Russia would basically sit at a table like in the 19th century with rulers and just draw up spheres of influence. This is what Putin would like, what Putin hoped to have from Donald Trump. That is why they were cracking open champagne bottles in Moscow when Trump was elected. But such an imperialistic approach to dealing with Ukraine would totally ignore Ukraine from this grand bargain, of course, and it would be imposed upon Ukraine. Again, a rather strange thing for people on the left to support. Thirdly, they tend to be very apologetic and therefore kind of indirectly support the most brazen land grab of territory in the Crimea since World War II. Since the 1930s, since Nazi Germany's expansionism in the 1930s. They tend to revert back to 19th century and Soviet kind of imperial historiography about the Crimea, about that region of Ukraine and Ukrainian-Russian relations. They often argue that the Crimea was always Russian, and therefore what's the problem? The Crimea is just going back to Russia, where it should have always been, shouldn't really have been part of Ukraine. The problem with their arguments, again, it's a very imperialistic view of history. It's arguing, in effect, that the Crimea had no history prior to the 1780s, when the territory was taken from Ottoman Turkey and incorporated into the Tsarist Russian Empire. If we use the exact same arguments that they use about the Crimea, that it was rightfully part of Russia, because it was part of Russia from the 1780s, then we could say that in North and South America there was no history prior to the arrival of European colonists, which I think, again, would not be the correct way to describe history of these two continents in this very multicultural and pluralistic environment that we normally want to see in academic studies. Another way that they approach it, which is very wrong, is to look at it through Russian or through Moscow's eyes, through Putin's eyes, and describe the war in eastern Ukraine as de facto a civil war between Russian and Ukrainian speakers. The degree to which this kind of lie has permeated many people could be seen in an article I read on the BBC website just 2 weeks ago that I made an official complaint about, that claimed that language was at the core of the conflict in eastern Ukraine. It's not. Never was. And this was purely espousing propaganda coming from Moscow. 80% of Ukrainians, that means Russian and Ukrainian speakers in Ukraine, believe that the war is a product of Russian aggression against Ukraine or Russian military support given to its proxy forces in the Donbas. Over 80% of Ukrainians also believe, again that must mean Russian and Ukrainian speakers, believe that Russia's aim in this war is to destroy Ukrainian independence. The majority of soldiers fighting for Ukraine on the front line, about anything between 50-60%, President Poroshenko talks of 2/3, are Russian speakers, and I can vouch for that myself. There are even Russian speakers in some of the nationalist units in the East. How, therefore, is this a conflict between Eastern and Western Russian and Ukrainian speakers? But the main factor why this is completely untrue is seen in what happened in eastern and southern Ukraine in 2014. This region, which is 8 oblasts, 8 districts, 8 provinces, is primarily Russian-speaking. Putin described it as a new Russia, this very old Tsarist term. He wrongly used that term because Kharkiv was never part of New Russia in the Tsarist era. But nevertheless, he believed that these Russian speakers would rise up and support Putin's intervention. Well, he was proven totally wrong, and then by the summer of 2014, Putin stopped talking about New Russia. Why? Because the majority of Russian speakers in these regions supported Kiev. They did not support Putin. And one can see that with the huge number of volunteers, particularly women who work in these volunteers' offices in southern and eastern Ukraine, who are primarily Russian speakers. And therefore, this is not a civil war between Ukrainian and Russian speakers. Most importantly, it is bizarre for any bona fide person who wants to be treated as a serious academic to support President Putin and his policies when President Putin has created a police state and he is a violent thug. There's no other way to describe him. Freedom House and various other Western think tanks describe Russia since at least the mid-2000s as a consolidated authoritarian regime. Some scholars today, Alexander Motyl and scholars from Russia, go one step further and describe Putin's Russia as already evolving into a fascist regime. There's obviously no free democratic elections in Russia. Putin is very scared of going into a second round facing an opponent, and therefore he ensures that he always wins, in inverted commas, in the first round. And anybody who's critical of Putin is assassinated, whether at home or more recently, for example, about a week ago in Kiev, abroad. And there have been at least 10 assassinations of Putin's opponents in the last decade or so. Putin, and this is my sixth point, is also somebody rather odd to align with when he is a sociopath. He has no common feeling for human life, and that's been seen on so many occasions, and I'll give a few examples. Many experts believe that it was Putin's FSB, the successor in Russia to the KGB, that organized the apartment bombings in Moscow in 1999 that led to the deaths of 300 civilians. The FSB were caught red-handed planting bombs in the Russian city of Ryazan. And this was an attempt to inflame nationalism against the Chechens to help Putin come to power. So he's willing to kill, at the beginning of his own presidency, 300 of his own people. In the first year of his presidency, the Kursk submarine drowned with 120 sailors, and he showed no remorse, no sympathy, no sorrow for those Russian sailors. Two tragic events when Chechens terrorists took hold of a theater in Moscow and a school in the northern Caucasus. Putin, in a very heavy-handed way, sent in Russian special forces and didn't really give a damn that so many civilians died in both occasions. In the case of the theater, about 200 civilians died in addition to the terrorists, but more disgustingly, in Beslan, 400 people died, the majority of whom were children who were from that school. And finally, we should not be surprised at Russia's or Putin's actions in bombing the hell out of the Syrian city of Aleppo, because he'd already done the same thing a decade earlier when he bombed and flattened the Chechen city of Grozny. If Putin is willing to do that to his own city, a city in his own country, Grozny, then why should he be concerned about doing it to a foreign country? And the people left in Grozny when Russian planes flattened it were primarily Russians and Russian speakers, because the Chechens had fled to the surrounding villages where they have families. Putin is a warmonger. His regime survives on the basis of inflaming nationalism, xenophobia, and launching so-called small victorious wars. In the course of President Putin's presidencies since 2000, he's had 4 wars. Chechnya, at the beginning of his presidency, Georgia in 2008, Ukraine since 2014, and more recently Syria. With declining support inside Russia, and we saw that with the mass protests in Russia over the weekend, it wouldn't be a surprise for Putin to now launch another war to distract public attention against what is taking place inside Russia in terms of his mafioso regime. Putin has inflamed Russian nationalistic chauvinism against Ukraine. He's not only annexed the Crimea and has 10,000 troops occupying eastern Donbas, but more importantly, and this is what the United Nations has brought up, hostile television propaganda against Ukrainians, depicting them as basically inhuman fascists, with countless lies about what Ukrainian soldiers allegedly have done. This has served to inflame the conflict and served to produce human rights infringements and war crimes. The United Nations points at this kind of propaganda as being the source of these kind of war crimes, attacks by Russian and Russian proxy forces against Ukrainian civilians, Tatar civilians, and against Ukrainian soldiers. And that's been a massive onslaught in the media starting in 2013, particularly to 2015. The war has led to massive destruction of infrastructure, of homes, of factories, coal mines in the Donbas. The country that should be paying reparations for all of that destruction is Russia. It should not be Ukraine that's having to finance the rebuilding of the Donbas. And finally, at a minimum, and this is what the United Nations calculate, there have been 10,000 civilian deaths. I estimate it being far higher. I estimate a combined civilian and combatants total casualties of 30,000 plus. There was a report from German intelligence a few years ago saying that it was close to 50,000. But certainly 10,000 that the UN estimate is a minimum. So therefore, this blood is on Putin's hands. Russian TV propaganda and Russian racism infringes the rights not only of Ukrainians, but of Jews and Crimean Tatars. Ukrainians are the third largest national minority, some say the second largest, in the Russian Federation, and they don't have any national minority rights. There's no autonomy, there's no Ukrainian language school, there's no Ukrainian language media, nothing. When these Russian experts in the West raise the problems of, the so-called problems of Russian speakers encountering in Ukraine, it's funny how they never then talk about the problems encountered by the Ukrainian minority in their beloved Russia. The Ukraine Library, for example, in Moscow, has been under constant repression since 2014, and its librarians, to the protests of Amnesty International, have been imprisoned, which kind of reflects this Ukrainophobic sentiment and atmosphere inside Russia. Why has there been no protests from Russian experts, Russophiles, Putinophiles, to the entire closure of all Ukrainian schools and Ukrainian media in the Donbas, and to the closure of all Ukrainian schools and Crimean Tatar schools and media in the Crimea? No protests at all. All they do is focus on so-called infringements of Russian speakers. Similarly with churches, the repression of Ukrainian Orthodox, Greek Catholic, and Tatar churches in the Crimea and in the Russian proxy-controlled regions of the Donbas. And what about the question of anti-Semitism, which I raise in a separate chapter in my new book, Putin's War Against Ukraine? Why is it that if Ukraine is so bad, why is it that the Jews in the separatist proxy-controlled regions have fled from those regions to Ukraine? Because anti-Zionism was always in the Soviet Union a camouflaged anti-Semitism, and the Jewish minority in the Donbas, in areas controlled by Russian proxies, have fled, many of them to Dnipropetrovsk, the neighboring oblast. There have also been murders of Protestant pastors and the closure of Protestant churches, both in western Donbas when it was occupied by Russian forces led by Igor Girkin, and in other parts of the Donbas. Finally, let's be quite open and frank. Putin is an international war criminal. He's committed massive war crimes already in Chechnya when he came to power. Estimates are that approximately a tenth of the population of Chechnya died as a consequence of that war. That's about 100,000 out of 1 million people in Chechnya. And then we've had subsequent war crimes committed in the Donbas and Syria. Putin's actions have violated the UN Charter, the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, documents and treaties, and many other international laws and treaties. His annexation of the Crimea and occupation of parts of the Donbas has violated the 1994 Budapest Memorandum, which Russia, together with the US and Britain, signed after Ukraine agreed to give up nuclear weapons, and also the 1997 Russia-Ukraine Interstate Treaty, which recognized the existing borders they inherited from the Soviet Union. So therefore, Putin is somebody who has blood on his hands, who's created a mafia state. Just look at the investigations taking place of Russian organized crime, money laundering in Spain today. And he's committed war crimes and led to terrible destruction and deaths of civilians in Ukraine. Why anybody with any moral or particularly socialist principles would want to have anything to do with Vladimir Putin is beyond me. They should be ashamed of themselves. Thank you.